change. Thank you, recording in progress, lady. So the storyline that I'm interested in is the story of climate change, what's causing it, what it is, who are the actors, what's going on, and particularly what's the role of education in the story. So I'm just going to frame the beginning of this conversation by talking about the different stories and the different ways in which we can think about the story of climate change. So the first one is this visual representation that I've created here from a report that I wrote about a year or so ago now, actually during the pandemic, which was looking at trying to understand the many different levels that we might use when we want to think about climate change. So at a top line level, we can think about this being a scientific, an engineering, a technical problem, and the implications of that for education is this idea that we need STEM education, we need science and technology education, we need innovation. The second level is the idea that it's a structural problem, that it's our economic and our social issues that drive our excess and unequal forms of consumption. So what this might mean for education is an education in politics, an education in social sciences, an education in kind of critical thinking. Sorry, I'm just trying to move the screen a little bit. Thank you, so that I can't see everybody having their lunch. There we go, that's better. We might think of this as a worldview level. We might think about the climate change as coming out from a fundamental knowledge problem. So the idea that it's something to do with how we don't share information with each other. And I've seen this a lot in the storylines discussion, the idea that actually if only we can get interdisciplinary working, we'll all be fine. And finally, we get this idea that it's a foundational narrative problem, that the problem with climate change is to do with how we think about our relationship with the planet. So that's one way of framing what we think about climate change. A different way of thinking about it is this one that Karen O'Brien and Robin Leichenko present, which is looking at how we might respond to climate change, how we might deal with it. And they frame it in three ways. They talk about the practical level, the political level, and the personal level. And they argue that there's action required at all of these different domains. So the practical is the behaviors and technical responses, the political is systems and structures, the personal is beliefs and values, worldviews and paradigms. Another way of looking at this is Dana Meadows. Dana Meadows was one of the great early environmentalists who was involved in the early Club of Rome modeling in the 1970s. And she talks about what are the different levers of change in relation to climate change. And what's critical here for the story that I'm going to tell is that up here at the top, she argues that one of the critical levers for change is the issue of values. Okay, so the paradigm used to design the system, the goals that we think we're aiming for, and the power to shift that, to deal with new challenges. So right up here at the top is really the role of education, because education is what gives us the chance to change and to develop new challenges. So what's interesting for me when we look at these three framings is that across all of them, it suggests that the deepest level, the issue that we need to address when we're thinking about climate change is the idea of the foundational stories that we're telling about the world. Those stories about our relationship to the world are powerful. They drive some of the problems and they're also levers of change. And I want to suggest that when we think about climate change at the moment, there are some stories that go really deep and that are causing us some serious and profound difficulties. And these stories are stories that the planet is here to serve us, that we're separate from other beings and other species, that the purpose of our countries and governments is to protect the economy, that growth is good and should govern how we organize ourselves, and that fundamentally our job in life as humans is to invest in our human capital to secure wealth and well-being in the future. So you've got this really fundamental idea of the separation of humans and other species, and the sense that humans should be investing in themselves, in the economy, in order to secure this future that's going to come out there. And these stories are given many different names. I'm sure many of you will know Kimberly Nichols' great book, Under the Sky We Make. She calls this an extractivist story. Vanessa Andriotti, Elwood Jimmy, Sharon Stein, working in Canada in the Decolonizing Futures Collective, call this narrative simply modernity. and others call it late stage capitalism. But whatever we call these stories, the one thing we know for sure is that they're killing us and millions of other beings. Fortunately, there are more and more people suggesting that there are other stories that we might want to live by and recovering other stories we've forgotten. And I'm thinking here in particular of people like Kate Raworth, the economist, who's rewriting economics to tell a different story. So the deep stories that sit underneath our culture are shaping our lives in many ways. And the story that I want to focus us in on today is the story of time. What time is, how we tell the time, what we think time is for. Now, bear with me. I know that sounds a bit abstract. I know it's Saturday afternoon. I don't know what it's like with you in Sweden, but it's very sunny here. So generally there's a question, can we deal with these sorts of questions on a Saturday afternoon when we might, usually be doing something else? But hang on with me. I will come back to the implications for education. So the point I want to make today is a really simple one, which is that the way we have of thinking about time and living in time today is one of the key elements of our civilization's stories about itself. And that if we can find ways of thinking differently about what it means to live in time, then we might be able to untangle ourselves from some of the more harmful ways of living that we're demonstrating at the moment. So let's think about some of the ways that the way we think about time might be a problem in terms of how we organize our ways of living at the moment. So we have in Sweden and in the UK, for example, a political system that elects people for 3 or 4, maximum 5 years. And at the same time, we have a social system and an economic system that's stacking up long-term environmental and social harms. So there is a fundamental mismatch in our timescales and in our capacity to coordinate ourselves in time in relation to the challenges we face and our capacity to do the structural thinking about it. Another temporal problem for the stories that we live with today is where we're dependent upon species and creatures and systems that operate on completely different timescales from our own as humans. So this could be the timescale of a 300-year future of carbon dioxide atoms lasting in the atmosphere, those carbon dioxide atoms being emitted from our burning fuels that are made out of sea creatures who died millions of years ago. We are, Catherine Newsoff calls us, geological lives. Our lives are, if you like, caught in the spaces between 2 different fossils, the fossils that we're burning as fuel and the fossils that we will become in the Anthropocene. Our lives are also dependent on the infinite sensitivity of insects and plant life, who are themselves sensitive to changes in the weather. And yet we as humans are hardwired to think only within our own timescale. Another temporal problem, our economic system encourages us actively to be miserable in the present. Says it doesn't matter. You have to do whatever you have to do to get the jobs, to get the money, to get the things that will promise you security and happiness in the future on an individual level. And finally, our society values speed and efficiency when we're thinking. So I'm super distracted by that very beautiful dog that there is there. He's gorgeous. Hello, lovely dog. Join the conversation. Nice to see you. Anyway, I don't know who else can see it, but there we are. But our society is also one that values speed and efficiency, suggests that you're making good use of time is the kind of overarching value. When we know that things like thinking, reading, caring, parenting, loving, gardening, looking after gorgeous dogs has their own timescale, has their own temporality. And some things resist being made more efficient. So there's a phrase in psychology which is called evolutionary mismatch, where there's a gap between the world as it is and the environment a species finds itself in and the cognitive and physical capabilities it has at its disposal. And I'm thinking here of the white Arctic hare that fails to camouflage itself in the brown, snowless landscape. It's no longer responding to what's going on. And I want to suggest we have the same problem with how we're thinking about time today. The cognitive tools we have to conceptualize time, to understand ourselves in time, are simply not adequate for the world that we're living in. We struggle with timescales beyond the human. We struggle to coordinate time and imagine time beyond our own. And we've habits of thinking about time that work against creating well-being in the present. So we need to think about how we think about time. We need different ways of doing this. We need to expand what I would call our temporal repertoire, the sorts of metaphors and ideas and resources for having an understanding of this strange old thing we call time. There's a brilliant book by a wonderful novelist called Ruth Ozeki, which is called A Tale for the Time Being. And I love this idea. I think, what would it be to conceive of ourselves as time beings alongside other time beings? We live in time like fishes live in water, and yet we don't pay our attention to it, other than in a language of efficiency. So if I was at a really geeky conference about time, this is the point at which I might go into a big story about what we think time is. So the difference between time as physics, which is an idea of time out there, if you like, or time as a property of psychology, time in here that we experience differently. We all know that time can feel fast or slow, long or quick, or time as a problem of society. So this is time as a way of coordinating people and activities. I could go into the fact that humans have been thinking about time for years and that it's incredibly complicated. And if even St. Augustine said, he basically said, to paraphrase, I know what time is until I start thinking about it and then I get really confused. So, you know, if that's where St. Augustine was, then I think it's okay for us to kind of struggle and grapple with it. I could also point out the way that a big row about time has shaped the last 100 years. So about 100 years ago, French philosopher Henri Bergson, then one of the most influential people in the world, had a huge row with Albert Einstein about who could say what time was. And arguably what came out of that argument, which also led to Einstein not getting the Nobel Prize for special relativity, geeky side effect, but anyway. But what came out of that was a huge rift in philosophy and physics that we've been dealing with ever since. So there is a history to how we think about time, but I find the easiest way to do this, to just warm us up in thinking about time and to think about how we might work with it in education, is just to try to visualize it for a second. So just take a moment and think, shut your eyes if you find that comfortable. What shape do I see time as? What shapes or patterns can you see when you try to think about time? If our chat is open, just take a second and write down in the chat what shapes you see in time. What shape is time? We've got we've got white, a circle, a wavy line, bubbles, circles, ellipses, a line. Lovely. Any others? I don't believe that. Yeah, mist. Oh, that's a beautiful one. I haven't heard that one before. Plasma that moves and is not constant. Gorgeous. A line with lots of branches. Great. Okay, keep thinking about those. There are loads of different ways in which we might think about time. This is a very common image for thinking about time in the West, in modernity, the famous idea of time's arrow, this idea of going past, present, and future. This is a very common image of time's arrow plus the overarching image of modernity. In other words, the idea of progress. So things are not just going from past, present, to future, but they're all getting better, okay? Which gives us all sorts of troubles when something goes wrong. We've got the image of time as a circle, which came up a few times in your comments. We've got image of time as waves. This was an image that was central to the 14th century sociologist Ibn Khaldun. He had an entire theory of time and society as wave-like. You could have an image of time as a tree. This is common if we're thinking about complexity theory, but also trees. Trees have shaped philosophy for years and years and years. So everybody from Newton sitting under a tree having an apple falling on his head to the Buddha sitting under a tree next to a river, all of them have been struggling with time in particular ways, and trees have been beings to think with as we think about time. These are a couple of others. We might think of time as layers. So this up here on the top left, this is a common framing from European thought, which is the past behind us. This is the series of lines here, the idea common in different indigenous communities often, the idea of time as beneath us, as something that we are part of, that's still interconnected with us. There's a fantastic image in anthropology of a nation in the Amazon who conceptualize of time as a pile of leaves. And so you have history underneath you at the bottom of the leaves and life growing on top of it. And then one of the things that they do in their shamanic traditions is to muck up that pile of leaves, to reconnect and remingle the past, present, and future. When I think about these things, I always wonder, well, what difference does it make to be in a society where you have the past underneath you or the past behind you? This image here in the middle is the one that I often work with, which is the idea of pasts and futures feeding into the present. So you get this idea that we see in a lot of places, the beginning of the idea of the thick present. Donna Haraway talks about this, not from the same basis. So lots of different ways of thinking about time. The critical thing is that the images that we work with shape our perceptions of how the world works. The images we have of time shape our perceptions of possibility. So for example, we can think of time, if we think of time and speed, we can think of speed or slowness as a marker of success that will determine what we judge. If we think of time as operating along a single arrow of development, which means that we then judge other countries, other people, other children as slow or fast, then that shapes what we think about time. If we think about the future as something that we need to control and predict, or as a place of novelty that is constantly emerging and growing, that gives us a different orientation to the future. If we think about time as the time of my life, or the time of multiple generations, or the time of the lifetime of the oldest tree I know, we're thinking in different ways. All of these different temporal frames, what I call the temporal imagination, they shape our understanding of the world. They shape a sense of who we are, of what we value, and they direct our attention to what is important. So our ideas of time shape all of the storylines that we can create. So I just want to now turn to think about what this means in education. So firstly, the question that this raises for me is, how do we teach children to tell the time in our curriculum? And here I obviously don't just mean the fact that we teach them to read clocks as soon as they get to school, which is our first introduction to kids often in terms of time. And second, how do we teach children to tell the time through our hidden curriculum, through the messages that we give them every day in all of our actions about what it means to live in time? Last November, I sat with a group of teachers and asked them for one word to describe the experience of time in schools, a word to describe how time worked in schools. Again, have a moment, think about the schools that you know, think about the education you know, and think about how time is organized there. These were the words that came up: stressed, frantic, measured, planned, structured, controlled, not enough, hurried, threat. Critically, time in this environment was seen as a site of threat, as a punishment, as something that had to be controlled. Above all, time was something that was always having to be used wisely, a resource that cannot be wasted, and that has this sense of fixed limits. Time, in other words, in schooling, is often seen as a resource for extraction, a resource for mining, a resource for investment now because it will be beneficial in the future. We could argue then that in many, many ways, the hidden curriculum of schooling is the way in which we educate ourselves to think of time as a resource from which value is to be extracted in the future. The hidden temporal curriculum in schooling also tells us that time comes in boxes, in hours to be profitably used, not in the winding, curious exploration of tasks. It tells us that time, it equates time with clock time, not the time of the body, the time of the relationships, the time of what it takes to do something. So all of this is great preparation for a society in which time is to be extracted, mined, regulated, operating on a human scale and ordered towards future benefits. So I want to suggest that the story we accidentally tell about time and about life in schools is one of the underpinning cultural narratives that drives ecological extraction and climate change. The way we organize education is part of the problem. So think of this, think about how different this is from the other ideas of time we've just generated, the richness and complexity of what time might mean. Think about the fact that time is what we live in. Think about time as what it means to be alive. Living in time is by definition the moment of being alive. Time is messy, it's personal, it's rich, takes different shapes and forms, opens up different storylines. The good news is, even as we recognize that our educational structures are pointing us in that direction, we are also, as educational institutions and educators, able to work against this. We have the capacity in education, as Dana Meadows' systems image suggested, to reframe the paradigms we operate in. We can consciously reflect on time and use it as a subject of inquiry. We can tell different stories about time. And indeed, we're starting to see a whole load of very interesting modes of temporal storytelling emerging, what I call temporal pedagogy. And temporal pedagogies are interventions that are designed to intervene in, work with, and disrupt taken for granted ideas about time as a resource. And we can see a whole range of different people working to develop this. So we've got educators, activists, scholars, artists, all attempting to cultivate new ways of thinking about and with time in a whole raft of pedagogic experiments. And here I use the word pedagogy to refer not just to school, but to the range of different educational activities that are happening, because this issue about how we live in time is not a problem that just educators are thinking about right now. This is something that is very timely. There are a huge amount of people starting to think about this. So what I want to suggest is that we've got at least 5 categories of temporal pedagogy that I think are emerging at present. So the first of these is what we might call the Western traditions of futures literacies. And here we've got quite a long history now of people working in schools to support young people to think about how they conceptualize the future, right? How do you think about what this thing, the future, is? What is this thing called the future? And alongside that, we've got a massive growth in speculative futurism, speculative design, Afrofuturism, indigenous futurisms that are beginning to emerge, that are trying to suggest that that the way in which we think about and with futures at the moment is incredibly impoverished in popular culture. So we've got a real disruption of the idea that we've either got a narrative of the future as kind of apocalypse or as technological transformation. The second set of pedagogies that are emerging specifically from indigenous and decolonial studies. And these are pedagogies that are working with the co-presence of past and present and future, and the continuity of relationships with land. So here, for example, we can look at Joanne Ray's work, looking at Darug teaching in Australia, where they're drawing on 60,000 years of continued pedagogic practice in terms of the relationship with land and the coexistence, the co-presence of past, present, and future associated in one place. And we can also see this in Coelho's account of intergenerational storytelling. The third category of temporal pedagogy that I'm particularly interested in draws from our Western European kind of education philosophy traditions. And here we can start to see educators focusing on educational time as precisely a time of suspension of time. So in this framing, we get the idea that time isn't something that, that education is not a site, if you like, between past, present and future, but is its own time in and of itself, that we suspend the idea that we put children simply at service of the future. And instead we see time, the educational time, as a space to allow the new to emerge. This ties in also to Karen O'Brien's fantastic work on agency in conditions of climate change, where she's drawing in theories of complexity and emergence. I can talk about that in a bit if we go into questions. And the fourth category that I'm particularly interested in, but which is very poorly documented, draws attention to temporality of thresholds of transitions, that is really about supporting us to recognize change as a defining feature of our lives. So here we might look at the work around ritual and ceremony that allows young people to enter different phases of their lives. And this is something that I think is hugely lacking in our current educational traditions. This question of how we mark the disruptions, the discontinuity in our lives, our shift from one time of being to another. This work, I think, also includes the practices that allow us to deal with, if you like, the loss of time, with grief, with reversal, with where things stop working, with where time stops passing. So we see, for example, as in Joanna Macy's work, a lot of grief work. And here this is about allowing us to recognize that time does pass, that is not necessarily a cause for sadness. It is simply a reality of what it means to be time beings, to live in time. And the final category, the pedagogy of braided time, is the shift towards recognizing that our human timescales and our human temporalities are going to be inadequate for understanding what it means to live in the world today. And here we see the sort of work of people like the Common Worlds Collective, who are encouraging us towards multi-species encounters. So what does it mean to live alongside the timescales of other beings? And we can also see it in the sorts of pedagogies that are trying to allow young people to connect their time with the time of others. Who else is living at the moment? What does it mean to be co-present in time? How do I imaginatively occupy somebody else's time? So this is a quick whistle-stop tour around discussions of time and education and the way in which time sits underneath our stories. I want to come back, there we go, to some questions for this conference specifically that might come out of this attention to thinking about time as one of the key underpinning narratives of our society. And I would suggest one of the key underpinning arguments, the key underpinning frames that is causing us some difficulty when we're thinking about how to address climate change and other issues. So there are some questions that you might want to explore. Whose times? What is the time? What is the timescape of your storyline? Whose times and what times does it include or include? Are there non-human storylines? Are there timelines that take account of deep history and deep futures of the places that you're working in? One of the most lovely gardening books I've ever read is a fantastic book called Gardening at the Dragon's Gate, which is written by a Buddhist nun who works in a Buddhist monastery just outside San Francisco. And she starts the book telling the story of the millennium deep history of the soil and of the plant life in the area. And what that means is as you work your way through the book, you suddenly realize that the plants that she's talking about now have this history, have this ancestry. So mare's tails and horse's tails are plants are the kind of oldest plants in that garden. And we might ask the same, where are we working? What's the deep history, the deep storyline to the places that we're working? These questions might ask us to pay attention to the sort of disruptive stories. How do we shift beyond this idea as we engage young people and others in making change, away from just this idea of, don't worry, if we all get together, we'll be able to fix this. It's one simple narrative. Where are the stories about reversal, disruption, circularity, decay, loss? How do we deal with failure? How do we deal with the fact that things sometimes go round? I know that many of us feminists for example, have been shocked by the return of patriarchy with a vengeance with the election of Donald Trump. Many of us who've been working in the field of peace studies for years are now confronting the return of the nuclear threat. Time doesn't go in single lines. Where are the stories of these sorts of disruptions and uncomfortable resistances that we're working with our students? And then how are the sorts of futures that are being imagined in our storyline? How are they generated? Whose futures are they? How are they contested? What would it take to play with a wide variety of different futures and use these to reflect on the present in the field that we're working in? And most importantly, when we think about the story making we're involved with, when we think about the storylines we're involved with, how do we create space in schools to give it its own time? And what sorts of new time is it generating in the schools? And then how might these richer times that are emerging in these schools, how might they infect the hidden curriculum of school time? How do they allow our students that wonderful experience of a suspension of linear time, that deep thinking that we all know in a great educational moment, that deep moment when time is suspended, when we're listening, when we're responding, when we're attuning, when we're noticing what's going on in the moment. The time, in other words, of life, because it is in the moment that we live, not in the future, not in the past. So this is where I want to end, because after all, any discussion of time is, after all, a discussion of life, what it is and how we live well. Thank you for inviting me to speak today. I have no idea where we are in time, a little bit over, sorry for that. I wish you all the joy of slow thought and unexpected ripples and transformations. And I wish you all the pleasure of being in these conversations for their own sake right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Keri. It was very interesting to listen to you and kind of thought-provoking also. As Swedes, we are obsessed with time and being on time. And tonight, everybody, we will miss 1 hour. We will also thank you, Keri, with a tree. So we will plant a tree. Do you know where it is, Ylva?
In East Africa.
In East Africa, we will plant a tree in your name. I'm not sure if you can see it here, but I'm holding it up for the audience here. So thank you very much for joining us here today.
Thank you. It's been lovely to be with you. Have a good day.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, my head is now full. I will have to take your questions, the last ones, up again and again, I think. It's both new thoughts and it's also in English. And I think a lot of us are very, very tired thinking in English the full day. But I found your presentation very interesting. And we will now go into breakout rooms. So Margareta is creating breakout rooms for us. And when you come into a breakout room, what we want you to do is to, first of all, present yourself. This is the first time the people online can meet with each other, okay? So you present yourself, tell your name, profession, and where you come from. And then we have 2 questions for you to discuss in the room. The first one is, what have you learned or reflected from today's presentations? And the second one is, what do you bring to your own organization? And for the people online, you will just be thrown into a room that Margareta is creating. And the ones in the room here, I would like you to speak to someone that you don't really know so much, because your colleagues you can meet every day. So if you can just sort of move around and get hold of 2 or 3 people so you can introduce yourself and speak to each other. And as Margareta said, we are losing 1 hour. Yeah, maybe you can't think like that, but we are putting the clock forward 1 hour this night. And that is, of course, a small catastrophe, at least in my life. But anyway, so we will be meeting here again 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. Okay? Summertime. Is the breakout rooms ready, Margareta?